A man dies and he comes to heaven and wants to get in to the place where all the virtuous people go. I tell him, listen, if you want to get in here, you got to pay. Okay, how much does it cost? So they tell him what it costs. He takes out a checkbook. He starts writing a check and tell them, no. Over here we take only receipts. When we were growing up, our teachers told us a story. There's different versions to the story. And the details of the story are immaterial because the story is an allegory. It's a mashal. About a person who hears that in a faraway land, diamonds and gold and silver and all kinds of precious stones are rolling around the street like pebbles. So he collects whatever he can gather of his wealth. He buys himself a ticket on a ship and he travels a great distance and he comes to this land and he lands on the beach. And lo and behold, there's diamonds on the floor rolling around like pebbles, diamonds and gold. So he picks up a handful of diamonds and he puts them in his pocket. He goes into the first store and he wants to buy breakfast. You can't buy breakfast with this. This is a pebble. How can I buy breakfast? Breakfast? Chicken fat. How do you get chicken fat? You have to earn it. How do you earn it? You got to work hard. So this guy who came to this island to collect diamonds fills up a whole valise with diamonds, but he has no money to return home. And to return home, he needs to have 1,000 pounds of chicken fat. 1,000 pounds of chicken fat is, for a newcomer, a year's labor to earn 1,000 pounds of chicken fat. And he's got to feed himself and house himself and clothe himself during the interim. So he's got these suitcases full of diamonds and gold. He puts them away in this little room. And he starts to work to earn chicken fat. And eventually he gets so caught up with the chicken fat that it becomes like currency. Chicken fat is currency. You can buy breakfast with chicken fat. You can buy... The only thing you want to do is eat it. Otherwise it's terrific. And eventually, he forgets that he came to the island to collect diamonds. And he empties his valises and he fills them up with chicken fat. This is priceless stuff. You know what you can do with chicken fat? And eventually, he has enough money to buy a ticket to go home. He's got suitcases full of chicken fat, and he comes home and he lands and his family is waiting for him and he opens you can't imagine what I have, he says. He says, boxes and boxes by now, it's spoiled, rotten, smelly chicken fat. They say, but you went to get diamonds. Oh, I forgot. I went to this place. They use chicken fat as currency as opposed to diamonds. And they look through all of his valises and a couple of greasy little diamonds that accidentally he forgot to dispose of. And that's what they live on. The message of the allegory is, an neshama comes from Gan Eden. And in Gan Eden, they hear that in this world you can acquire diamonds. What are the diamonds? Torah mitzvahs. When you get to this world, you discover that the currency of this life is chicken fat, is nonsense. So you come here all excited, you're going to collect diamonds, and they're literally rolling in the streets. How difficult is it to do a mitzvah? But when you start collecting diamonds, you discover in order to sustain yourself while you're collecting your diamonds until you can take them back home, you have to devote your entire identity to collecting chicken fat. And they get so caught up in the chicken fat that chicken fat becomes currency. And you completely forget that this is interim, that this is temporary, that this is a means to an end. And you come home with boxes and boxes and boxes of chicken fat. And they ask you, so what have you earned? I can give you as much chicken fat as you want. They say, no, over here we need diamonds. He says, well, I threw my diamonds out so I can collect chicken fat. And this is, it's a great illustration of the priorities in life that we so frequently forget about. The topic of tonight's class is the concept of reward. Schar. For mitzvahs, there's reward. Specifically, our class is going to focus on the reward for the mitzvah of tzedakah, which, as you know by now, it seems to be, so to speak, the primary focus of the Alter Rebbe in the Iggeres Hakodesh, in his letters, tzedakah, because he himself was so preoccupied with tzedakah and he felt that giving lots of tzedakah is very helpful to everybody, as we've discussed so many times. But he talks about the concept of a reward. But I want to give you some background. Before I get into the question of reward and the various different types and levels of reward, and this class is rather mystical. A lot of what we're going to discuss tonight is based on some mystical principles. But I want to preface by sharing with you one of the most famous commentaries ever made by Maimonides, made by the Rambam. The Rambam discusses reward, schar, in the introduction to chapter 10 of Sanhedrin. Now, you may not be familiar with Sanhedrin, but it so happens that the first verse, the first Mishnah of chapter 10 of Sanhedrin is what we say each Shabbos before we say Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avos. Kol Yisrael yesh la machir l'elam haba. Every Jew has a portion of the world to come. So it's on this Mishnah that the Rambam has a very, very famous discussion on the concept of reward. And it is in this context, in this place, where Rambam introduces us to his 13 principles of faith. Rambam was the one who wrote the 13 principles of faith, and they are found in his introduction to chapter 10 of Sanhedrin. We discuss it, amongst other things, reward. And he makes an observation. That is, that when you discuss reward, what you are really discussing is meaning. What would you like for serving Hashem? Your answer to that question exposes what and who you are. What would I like for reward for serving Hashem? Will tell everybody what I am as a person. And he says, just in case you have a hard time understanding that concept, I'll give you a safe example. We'll talk about them, because we're not like them, because we're adults. Who's them? Little kids. When a kid goes to school, in his earliest of ages, you tell me you go to school and you be a good boy, I'm going to give you a cookie. Of course, we wouldn't do anything for a cookie. We're much too sophisticated for that. But little kids do things for a cookie. Eventually, the cookie doesn't work for that little child anymore. It's nice that, you know what, you'll go to school, I'll give you a toy. Okay, that's a deal. Eventually, the child reaches an age where toys don't impress him anymore. Now you have to give him money. And eventually, money doesn't hurt him anymore. And eventually, you have to move on to flattery. You have to build him up. You got to tell him how great he is, how great he's going to become. As people evolve, you have to find different motivations. So that, of course, none of us would serve God for cookies or for toys or for money or for flattery, or would we? So the Rambam says, think about it. God is the creator of the universe. He's given us Torah and mitzvahs. And what we want for it is a cookie, is a toy, is money, is some honor. What I like to call, when I teach my students about the question of the word pizza with extra cheese, if that's what it's about, or is it about something more meaningful? And of course, so much of the answer to that question has to do with so much of our own sense of what's important. And the Rambam says all of us understand when you talk about a child, because children are safe, it's them, how trivial, how peripheral, how disconnected going to school and learning is from a cookie. The greatest reward for learning is knowledge. Not cookies, not toys, not money, not even flattery. They're extraneous. And the Rambam establishes a very logical constant that says, and I'm going to use my own paraphrase, anything you're involved with whose reward is extraneous, is outside of that thing, is not that meaningful. If I do something and what I'm going to get for it is something other than what I am doing, it's not that meaningful. If I am pursuing knowledge, what is the reward for the pursuit of the knowledge? The knowledge itself. That's substantive. That's real. That's meaningful. But if I am pursuing knowledge for a cookie or for a toy or for money or for flattery, to be very direct, I'm pathetic. And then the Rambam goes on to say, when you use this analogy, in this form, you recognize that when you talk about reward for serving God, you have to think about it in a mature way. And if you think about it in a mature way, you'll come to the obvious conclusion that it's not about pizza and extra cheese. Or to say it, in other words, the reward for serving God is the service itself. And to say it using a philosophical model, a more mystical form, the reward for serving God is a relationship with God. The reward for serving God is intimacy with God. And therefore the Rambam says, when you look in the Torah, especially in the Tanakh, especially in the scripture, Teshuvah B'Ksav, And you find almost exclusively allusions to material reward. You serve God, you'll get peace, you'll get money, you'll get children, you'll get things that are ultimately not that important. It creates a fundamental question on Teresh B'Ksav. Why doesn't God speak about more meaningful reward? This is true especially in the Tanakh and to a lesser degree also in the Talmud, in the Gemara, in the Chazal. And the Rambam says a very unfortunate answer. He says the Torah speaks this way because that's what most people want to hear most of the time. He says the Torah was written for everybody. And the way the Torah is designed is that the overt, the most explicit, the most external meaning of the Torah speaks to the greatest group of people. In Hebrew it's hamoin, in English it's the masses, which in some cultures is considered an unclean word. The individuals, the more sophisticated people, the more deep human beings who recognize that tzchar, mitzvah, the greatest reward for a relationship with God is the relationship with God, are few and far between, says Rambam. People who are honest with themselves realize that there aren't that people interested in it. They can read between the lines. That's the Rambam's philosophy. He establishes as a very introduction to his guide to the perplexed that the Torah is written in layers. And the deeper you go, the more sophisticated the Torah becomes, the more sublime, the more vague the Torah is in its method of communication, because the smaller the pool of people the Torah is speaking to. What the Rambam says, let's not be fools. Let's not live for pizza with extra cheese. Let us ascend and appreciate that the reward for mitzvahs is mitzvahs. The reward for a relationship with God is a relationship with God. It's a very wonderful commentary of Rambam. It's really classic. I mean, any darshan, any person who makes a living doing what I do is familiar with this Rambam, and so is his congregation, because it's one of those things that you constantly come across. You repeat in various different contexts, in different ways, and so forth. This letter addresses the issue of reward, and specifically the issue of of spiritual reward, of transcendent reward, of reward which is more than just, to use my paraphrase, pizza with extra cheese. Now, when we talk about reward for serving God, right, or reward for a relationship with God, there's something very, very basic that we must appreciate at the outset. What I'm about to say is incredibly logical, but very, very important to observe. And that is, it really doesn't matter what God gives us. It only matters what we are able to receive. God doesn't have any problems in giving us. The issue is, what's the point of God giving us gifts that were completely unconditioned, that were completely unqualified, that we're in no position to take? You know, the Chazal tell us, it's based on a pasuk, but it's a man of Chazal. Mashiach is going to come, God takes the sun out of its shield. What happens? Too much ultraviolet rays. What happens as a consequence? He says the righteous are healed by it, and the sinful are punished from it. So God is not rewarding. God is not punishing. We are rewarding. We are punishing. Our condition that we created for ourselves through our lives determines how the same gift of God is going to affect us. If we are in a favorable disposition, the extra light becomes a greater blessing. If we're in a compromised disposition, the extra light becomes overwhelming to us and then becomes destructive. So when you talk about divine reward, and I don't want to even mention the alternative, retribution, this is a long philosophy. There's actually two opinions amongst Jewish theologians whether reward and punishment is considered a natural law, a natural cause and effect, or is it a special act of God? It's a machlokes amongst Rishonim. Some say that when you do something and Hashem rewards you, Hashem hasn't rewarded you, you rewarded yourself. You know. Some say when we've done something we shouldn't have done and a negative consequence comes to us, we've in effect done it to ourselves. And others say it's a miracle, it's an act of God. There's different opinions and there's a whole discussion of the Rebbe, what the difference between these two perspectives is, but this is beyond tonight's discourses. We've got enough on our plate. But when you talk about reward alone, understand the issue of reward is that God should give us a gift, and the gift that God gives us should reach us. Because if it fails to reach us, it's meaningless. In fact, it could even be the opposite of positive. So we begin this way. The Gemara says, there's a discussion in the Talmud. There's quite a few discussions in the Talmud. But amongst the various discussions in the Talmud there's a Talmudic statement which is made, which Rambam quotes, that says, quote, Schar mitzvah b'hai al malik. There is no reward for mitzvahs in this lifetime. Okay, there are rabbis who disagree. This is a statement by one of the great rabbis. Rambam Maimonides agrees with this in part. Not entirely, in part. He quotes it, but apparently there's a context to it. The statement is there's no reward for mitzvahs in this lifetime. What does that mean? For being a Jew you get nothing? No. For being a Jew you get nothing that constitutes real reward, real compensation. The real reward for being a Jew is to appreciate the relationship with God itself. That doesn't exist now. Any kind of positive reciprocity, as it were, giving back from God to man that we experience now, the Rambam views as a support. You know, you're doing good things, Hashem gives you material so you can do better. In other words, you know, you have more money, you can do more mitzvahs. It's as simple as that. And so forth and so on. But this is a Talmudic statement. There's no reward for mitzvahs in this lifetime. There's an exception to this rule. And the exception to this rule is a Mishnah which we say every single morning in the prayers. Eilu dvarim she'ein lahem shir, pe'ev, ha'bikurim, ha'royin, eilu dvarim. Eilu dvarim, these are the things, she'adam oichel pe'reseh be'elam hazeh. You eat the fruit of it in this lifetime. Va'keren kayemes li'elam haba. And the principle is left for the world to come. So we say every morning in the Mishnah, we say it every morning in the davening, and I'll incidentally tell you why we do it. Because every one of us, man and woman, amongst Ashkenazim, I don't know what Sfardim do, says Birchat HaTorah. Baruch atah Hashem asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al divrei Torah, whatever the different versions. We thank God for the mitzvah of studying Torah. Now if you say the blessing on the Torah and don't study the Torah, it becomes a bracha levatala, a blessing in vain. So the Chazal instituted, the Rabbi instituted, right after you say that blessing, you immediately study Torah. So you say Torah Shebeksav, Yivrecha Hashem v'Yishmerecha, Birchat Kohanim, and then you say this Mishnah in the beginning of Masechet Pei, Eilu Dvarim she'ein lahem shir. And amongst the lines of sentences in this paragraph is, these are the mitzvahs she'adam oichel pe'reseh be'elam hazeh, a person eats their fruit in this lifetime, va'keren, and the principle, kayemes lahem, remains intact, let them go to the world to come. Ve'eluhem, kibbud aveim, honoring your parents, ugemilas chasadim, and being a kindness, and a few more. So, the Rebbe explains in one of his wonderful talks that the rule is as follows. There is no reward for mitzvahs in this lifetime. There's no reward for mitzvahs in a lifetime for the reason I gave you before. We're simply not in a position to get it. When we understand what reward means, and we appreciate that reward is not pizza with extra cheese, the reward for a relationship with God is a relationship with God. And in the world in which we live, that is so compromised, that is so challenged, that is so insufficient and inadequate, it's impossible to be rewarded for this lifetime. That's why reward for mitzvahs, according to this opinion, which is Rambam's halachic view, is left for a different world, a world which is far more consistent, far more in harmony with the relationship with God, that we can actually experience something much more substantive and meaningful. However, says the Rambam, says the Mishnah, and the Rebbe explains it, is an exception. When you do a mitzvah, which benefits another person materially, since what you did was an act whose goodness was felt immediately, the reward for that goodness must also be felt immediately. When I give tzedakah, what the poor man is thinking about Elam Haba, the poor man is thinking about breakfast. When I help a couple make a wedding, whatever the case is, my contribution, the good that I have done, has an effect on another human being. And as far as that human being is concerned, this is the be-all and end-all. You helped him materially. Therefore, when you do something which helps another person now, it's only reasonable that you should benefit also yourself now. So the rule is, schar mitzvah b'hayal maleka. The real, meaningful reward for mitzvahs is not now. Is in Elam Haba, is in another world. But when I do a mitzvah, that the benefit of this mitzvah is felt by somebody else now, there's paydas. Paydas means dividends. Paytas means the extra profits that are a spillover of the initial investment that we have now. And the keren kayemes, the true principle, in other words, those mitzvahs also, the true reward for those mitzvahs, is also in a world which is far more conducive for reward, because we'll be much more in tune, much more consistent, much more aligned with a life, with a purpose which is of much greater importance and meaning and value in the world in which we live now. And it will be in an environment which is conducive to be rewarded for having done what the Eibishter wanted. But you must understand that when you give tzedakah, when you have host guests, and you do these other mitzvahs, the reward you're getting now is pizza with extra cheese. It's just a bonus, something in addition. That since that person is happy, you should be happy as well. So the Alter Rebbe, when he talks about this concept, in other words, level one of reward is that mitzvot shebein adam lachavero, mitzvahs bein adam lachavere, between man and man. Since the other person is benefiting now, we benefit as well. But the benefit we're having now, that's not what it's really about. That's simply a dividend. It's an extra, so to speak, an extra blessing, which we're experiencing now because we are able to experience it now. Because the criteria for reward is not what God gives. It never is. The criteria for reward is what we're able to receive. And at the in the life which we're living, the notion that if I do good, I should be rewarded is a reflection of me, and not a reflection of God. And the good, therefore, is a reflection of me, not a reflection of God. So the Alter Rebbe says this is a very ultimately minimal concept of reward that comes to us through the veils, through the layers and the screens that allow for there to be a material world. In other words, it's material world. You know, in Torah, the blessings that God gives man are going to three categories, and in this order: children, health, and wealth. Children, health, and wealth. In that order. So when we benefit another human being, we benefit materially as well. Not that this is the real reward, but this is a dividend. And this becomes level one. First concept of reward. This is not the real spiritual notion of reward, but it is a first dimension. But then there are two more dimensions. A spiritual dimension and an absolute dimension. A spiritual dimension and what it will, for lack of words, which is even more than a spiritual dimension. And in Hasidic discussions, when they talk about levels 2 and 3 of reward, which I am calling a spiritual dimension and then an absolute dimension, they connect it to what we call Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, and Olam Haba, the world to come, Olam Haba. Gan Eden is the Garden of Eden. It's a spiritual, it's a place of pleasure. The word Eden means delight and pleasure. And the Neshama has a spiritual word in Gan Eden. In Olam Haba, in the world to come, you have a pleasure which is absolute. And I'm going to try to explain this to you. I want to try to explain this to you. Okay? What is the greatest single gift God could give us? This is a rhetorical question. The greatest single gift God could give us is Himself. Period. The truth with a capital T. The question is, what is the greatest gift that God could give us that we could receive? And of course the answer to that question is it depends where we are. If we're on a higher level, God can give us a greater gift. If we're on a lower level, God can give us a lesser gift. I think there's one thing we can all agree to. Nobody is prepared to receive God. The true reward, with a capital T, the reward which is the truth, God Himself, the absolute truth of God, nobody, the greatest servant of God, whose life was of the highest level of devoutness and commitment and sacrifice, the absolute truth is absolute. Nobody is absolute. And consequently, the phenomena of reward, even in a spiritual sense, indirectly reflects our lives. The more spiritual we are, the more we are spiritually sensitized to receive the spiritual gift that God gives us. The absolute truth is impossible for us to receive. So, in Hasidus, in mysticism, something very interesting, wonderful, and totally counterintuitive emerges. Something upside down comes out of this whole scenario, what I just described here. Okay? And I'm going to say it to you in allegory. And I must say at the outset, I am discussing with you letter 17 in the Tanya. But as I always do, I'm embellishing. I'm interpreting it in my own way based on other discussions that I have studied in Hasidus. I hope I'm loyal to the letter, but I want to develop the idea so you should understand it better. There's a very simple logical rule. What is the best way to have God? Not to try and take Him. Because the moment you reach for God, you frighten Him away.
No, sorry, what?
What is the best way to get God?
No, the last time.
Not to because the moment you reach for Him, you push Him away. In other words, the Zohar quote, "Leis machshava tfise beklal." No human mind can grasp God. Why not? Because you're trying. The moment you're interpreting God, is that God? That's your interpretation. The moment you are intellectually, emotionally, sensually, or spiritually in pursuit of the truth, that truth is not just the definition of the truth. It's a definition of the truth in your version. So it's never the whole truth. In other words, spirituality, like intellectualism and like emotion, have a subjective quality to it, have a certain element of self. And self, in the world of honesty, is selfish or ego. So in a relationship with God, which is based on my learning and my understanding, or my passions or my sensitizations, I am involved in that relationship. If I'm involved in that relationship, I am defining God. If I am defining God, it's not God anymore. So how can somebody have God? Not to try. Now, but if you don't try, then you have no relationship with God altogether. So then what? Then all bets are off. So Chassidus says, no, you're forgetting something very wonderful. In our relationship with God, there are two dimensions that must both be. Must both be. And if we don't have the combination of these two relationships, we're cheating ourselves and we're very far away from the truth and from the wholeness of what it means to be a Jew. The two relationships we have with God is a relationship based on ego and a relationship based on submission. And they're a tandem. They must work together. In a healthy servant of God, there is this fusion. What is my ego? What I understand, what I feel, what I'm sensitive to, what I appreciate, and what I value. What is submission? Just do what God says. For example, why do I put on tefillin? There are two answers to the question that are both absolutely true. I put on tefillin because God said so. I put on tefillin because tefillin means this and this and this. Or to say it more personally, tefillin means this and this and this and this to me. Why do I eat matzah? Because God said so. And matzah means humility, and matzah means faith, and matzah is a wonderful event, the whole family gets together, and all the rest. We, in our religious life, fuse those two things all the time. All the time. And ideally, we shouldn't do a single mitzvah. We shouldn't be involved in any religious exercise that doesn't combine both of these elements. Number one, being a Jew means submitting. Why do I serve God? Because God told me to. Conversation over. And at the same time, I personalize, I internalize, I make my mitzvahs and my Torah, my good deeds, meaningful to me. For the obvious reason that when you bring meaning into the mitzvahs that you do them better, and you do them in what we will call an enlightened way, a spiritually full way. There's a combination. And to use yeshivish jargon, for the rabbis and the scholars in the room, this is what we call ma'aseh and kavanah. Ma'aseh ha-mitzvah, you got to do it. Kavanat ha-mitzvah, the meaning behind the mitzvah. If you do mitzvahs without any kavanah, without any meaning and personalization, the Tanya quotes a Maimon Chazal, a Piskom, that says, mitzvah below kavanah, ki guf below neshama. A mitzvah done without any meaning is like a body without a soul. It's a good deed, but it's dead. Conversely, if you do only a kavanah, only a meditation, only a spiritual experience, and there is no act, you have a relationship with God. You have a relationship with your own God. A God in your own image, which is a completely self-centered exercise. And I'm going to tell you an anecdote for each. I'll tell you two episodes. I don't know if they're stories, but they're historical anecdotes, historical truths that reflect each half of this equation. The Baal Shem Tov, the Holy Baal Shem Tov, traveled to Frankfurt, which is in Germany. Now, Germans in general are very precise people, but they're dispassionate. We can't exactly define Germans, but people are very emotional. And the Baal Shem Tov walked into a shul, one of the big, gigantic shuls in Frankfurt, and he said, I cannot be in this shul. I can't. I said, why not? The shul is full of words of prayer. It's full of words of Torah. There's no space for me. So the people said to the Baal Shem Tov, that's such a wonderful compliment. That's such a nice thing to say. And the Baal Shem Tov said, it's not a compliment at all. Because the Zohar says when we speak words of prayer and we speak words of Torah, they're supposed to have wings. And the wings are supposed to raise them up. The wings of our words of Torah, the wings of our words of prayer, are passion. Ahavat Hashem Yeshem, the meaning we invest, the personalization. And if you do the mitzvahs dispassionately and they're wingless, they're stuck. Unfledged birds, they cannot move. The room is full of words, they can't rise up, there's no passion. That's what happens when you have the deed without the feeling. The flip side of that is, if you're familiar with the so-called golden age of Spain. I'm talking now 100 years before the expulsion, 150 years before the expulsion. Spanish Jewry was very blessed in so many ways, but they were theologically complicated by philosophy. They're very involved in Greek philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy. And there was a movement amongst Jews who saw philosophy as soid, as the secret, mystical secrets of the Torah. And they came to the conclusion that if you know the mystery, the secret behind the mitzvah, behind the deed is redundant. You don't do the act. The act is meaningless. It's what it symbolizes. The Simson Mikutzi, the Sar Mikutzi came to Spain and he says, I found tens of thousands of Jews who considered themselves religious, who had never in their lives worn tefillin. Because they meditated on tefillin. They understood the philosophy behind the tefillin, didn't do the deed. And that's tragic. Because ultimately we must do the act. Why? Because in the act, we submit to God. And in our submission to God, we have God Himself. So whenever we do Judaism, Yiddishkeit, so forgive my repetition, first of all, if we do a mitzvah that benefits another human being, that benefits us as well, immediately, here, now, in the interior world, there's a reward for the good deeds that we do between man and man in this life. But that's secondary. That's pizza with extra cheese. When you want to talk about reward, you must divide Jewish life into these two dimensions. My personal God and the absolute God. My personal, meaning, investment, issue with this mitzvah, and my submission, my absolute investment in this mitzvah. And each mitzvah must combine these aspects. Number one, why do we take the mitzvahs? Because God did so. So we don't mess around. We don't decide that we should do it differently. We don't enhance them. We don't change them. We don't, do them on schedule. Like when Pesach comes out on Tuesday, it's not good for the family. So you do Pesach the Saturday night before. What's the big deal? Instead of Monday night, Saturday night. What's the big deal? Somebody told me they did Pesach a week in advance. Because that was the only time they got together. Rachmana litzlan. It's a wonderful experience, but it's a mitzvah. A mitzvah means God said Monday night is Monday night, not the Saturday before. There is a need to just do what the Rebbe says, submit. And in that submission, in that acquiescence, that accepting, we have God Himself, what's called in the fancy language of Chassidus, Atzmus Zemhus, Hashem Himself. And in addition, there is the personal significance and meaning in the mitzvahs we do, which is also very, very important. It motivates our mitzvahs, it enlightens our mitzvahs, it enriches our mitzvahs, it motivates us, it enlightens us, and it enriches us. But that's personal. And therefore the reward for that is correspondingly personal. Which leads me to a more radical idea. And the more radical idea goes like this. There are two concepts of reward. A spiritual concept of reward and an absolute concept of reward. The spiritual concept of reward is what we call Gan Eden, which is what we get for the meaning, for the spiritual investment that we do. The absolute concept of reward is for doing the mitzvah, which is higher. the absolute concept of reward. For our submission, we have God Himself. The highest thing God can give us is Himself. We have access to God Himself by not trying in our submission. Here's the irony. The lower concept of reward, the spiritual, personal concept of reward, is individual. Not everybody gets it. Not everybody gets it in the same way. Not everybody gets it to the same degree. It depends how pious people are. But when it comes to the absolute concept of reward, which is far higher, you did one mitzvah, you're as good as anybody else. Kol Yisrael yesh lam chelik olam haba. Every Jew has a personal relationship with the absolute God if they submit it to Him once. So the funny thing about it is the lesser reward is more personal. I do more, I have more of it. I did less, I have less of it. The absolute reward is a across the board. Everybody has it. So Gan Eden depends. Olam Haba, which is far higher than Gan Eden, everybody has it. It's really, really interesting. And ultimately what it comes down to is this. When you do mitzvahs, there is the kavanah and then there's the ma'aseh. There's the meditation, there's the meaning of the mitzvah, and then there's the deed. The reward for the meaning of the mitzvah is in Gan Eden. It's a spiritual reward, which depends on how good we were. For the act, for the physical act of the mitzvah, we're going to get an absolute reward, and this reward everybody has. Everybody has a relationship with God. The question is, do we have a relationship with enlightenment? Now, it sounds to me like if you have God who needs enlightenment, it seems redundant. Enlightenment means experiencing something about God, a flavor of God, a trace of God, a light of God. If you have God Himself, it's redundant. Who needs it? And yet, ironically, in some kind of weird kind of way, Gan Eden, you earn. And it's very personal and very individuated. No two people are in the same place and the same level and so forth and so on. The Ma'aseh mitzvah, just doing that mitzvah with submission, is simple. Anybody can do it. This is our relationship with God Himself, and the reward for it is a relationship with God Himself, and it's absolutely universal. Everybody has access to it. In other words, there's something ironic, something oxymoronic, something inside out about how reward works. And let me move on. One of the most famous, and this is really true, one of the most famous theological arguments that exist amongst Jewish theologians is this question. What is the ultimate reward? I have shared with you three concepts. The first concept is really not on the table. Because the first concept is pizza with extra cheese. It's dividends. You were a good person, you get rewarded in the material world. That's not, in the scheme of what's meaningful, it isn't very meaningful. Then there is the spiritual reward for our identity as spiritual people, for our own ruchnius, the spiritual meaning and investment we invest in our spiritual lives and in every mitzvah that we perform, and so forth. Then there's the absolute reward which we have for doing deeds with discipline and Kabbalah, which is called Olam Haba. So there's a great argument, very, very well known, between Rambam and Ramban. Okay, don't confuse them. Maimonides and Nachmanides. Maimonides and Nachmanides are amongst the Jewish people's greatest theologians. What separates them fundamentally is that Maimonides was a philosopher and Nachmanides was a mystic. Maimonides was a strictly rationalist kind of theologian. Nachmanides was a mystical and spiritual type of theologian. And their question is, the ultimate reward is an in-body or out-of-body experience. This notion that because I submitted to God in doing mitzvahs, I'm not talking here about the meditation now, the spiritual, the kavanah, is it going to happen in the physical or is it going to happen in the spiritual? The answer, Rambam says, Maimonides, the philosopher, says, no body, just the soul. The ultimate reward, in other words, if you want to be close to God, then getting close to God is about our submission, you go out of the body. The body is a distraction, the body is not necessary, it's redundant, spiritual. Nachmanides, the Kabbalist, says exactly the opposite. The ultimate reward has to be physical. It must be physical. And there are various reasons why he says it, and one of the simple ones is because we submitted through physical acts. We serve God in the physical world. We serve God using physical things. So it stands to reason that the reward should be the physical itself. To say it in other words, we are going to be learning in a few weeks hence. Right? This is letter 17. 18, 19, I'll get to 20, which some people are looking forward to. When we're going to get to letter 20, we're going to explore one of the most profound mystical concepts. And that mystical concept is going to say, the closest you can be to God is when you are in a physical body. Spiritual souls in spiritual realms feel closer to God. You're never closer to God than you are in the physical body. The physical world, which is the lowest world, overtly on the outside, it's the godless realm. You don't experience God. In fact, you're never closer to God than you are in the physical world. When we get to that letter, we'll explore why that is. But what we need to say tonight, because I don't want to give away that letter, God forbid, and I also wanted to have a might have sooner or later, it's because this is the lowest realm. There's a symbological law that says if something has fallen further, it has fallen from a higher part of the tree. When a wall falls, the stones at the highest point in the tree fall furthest from the base. If this is the lowest world, it has to have the highest source. So Kabbalah has a very, very interesting position that says the ultimate word for a relationship with God is having God Himself. We get God Himself through the physical deeds, through our submission in our relationship with Him, as opposed to our efforts to try and define Him and define ourselves and define our relationship. And the reward for that is in the physical world, because in an ironic way, mysticism argues, Kabbalah argues, Hasidus explains, you're never closer to God than in the physical body. In fact, the Rebbe Maharash, one of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, said something really, really weird. He said, in that world, we're going to be rewarded for our submission. We're going to be rewarded for a physical deed. With the relationship with God Himself, everything is going to be backwards. The soul will be nourished by the body, rather than the body be nourished by the soul. Right now the body is a lump of clay. Everything vital, everything meaningful is spiritual. In that world, it'll be upside down. The soul will be nourished by the body. So we have two more concepts of reward. Number one, a spiritual concept of reward. The spiritual concept of reward happens in a spiritual world. And it's a reflection of our efforts. The more involved we were in serving God, the more spiritually in tune we were in our service of God, the more spiritual reward we accrue, we collect for ourselves. Number two, there is submission in Judaism. There's bittul. There is doing the deeds. There's doing what God says. When we submit and we do what God says, the reward for that is the God to whom we submitted. And that reward is the highest reward, the deepest reward, and the ultimate reward. And that reward has to be in a physical body. It cannot be in any other realm. It cannot be in any other space. So you have three notions. A physical reward, which is, then there's a spiritual reward, and then there's an absolute reward. Okay? Let's use one more word, which is very familiar to the people who are regulars here. Godliness. Remember godliness? We talked about him many times, and we will talk about him again. What does godliness mean? The light of God. Godliness as opposed to God. In Hasidic discourses, they say it, Elokus v'lo elokah. Elokut v'lo elokah. The difference between Elokus, godliness, and elokah, God. What's the difference between godliness and God? Godliness is called God's light. What does that mean, God's light? Weird concept, very difficult to comprehend, and to be sure, that's what Kabbalah is about, and what Hasidus is explaining. If you want to understand spirituality, you understand mysticism, you've got to wrap your mind around the idea of godliness. And people spend their whole life trying to understand this concept. Real mystics spend their whole lives trying to experience this concept. Okay? But what is godliness? Godliness is the light of God. Without delving into what that means, just think about a very, very simple, logical assertion, right? How much light do we have? How much of that light, or how much of the light that we have, can we value? The answer to that question, that depends entirely on our reflectors, on our conduits, on our receptors for light. Right? Everybody knows that they send these satellites up into space where there is no atmosphere. And they don't have, wires to keep those guys charged. And they can operate for incredible amounts of time using, in some cases, nuclear energy, and in other cases, solar energy. So these huge panels that are incredibly, incredibly light. They're thinner than tin foil, right? Because there's no gravity. So it doesn't have to be very, very strong, and so forth and so on. And they receive solar light. And they keep the batteries charged, and keep those machines in function, and so forth and so on, right? So how much electricity can they gather? There's two criteria. How much reflection area they have, and how much battery space they have. That's all. If you have a greater conductivity, you have a greater possibility to draw light to yourself, you have more efficient batteries, you can hold greater quality and quantity of energy. You have less efficient and smaller, you can hold less. It's as simple as that. I remember in the early 80s, there was this trend that people used to go jogging in these metallic suits. I don't know if you remember this. These silver, from head to toe, based on the principle that either they were deflecting the heat or they're bringing the heat to themselves. I don't know, but like everything else, that that went the way of the dodo bird. I don't see anybody do that recently. Because it was keeping you very hot. Okay, I get the picture. Point is, how much godliness can I have? That's not measured by godliness. That's measured by me. Godliness is infinite. But godliness and infinite means many different things, including there's infinite flavors. There's an infinite different ways to experience the infinity of godliness. Depending on what? On me. On the quality of my receptors, the quantity of my receptors, and the specific nature of my receptors. Some people love to study Torah. If they study lots of Torah, they have lots of intellectual receptors that are very efficient vehicles to receive spiritual godliness. Some people do more mitzvahs, and they do them, of course, with passion, with interest, with meaning, with investment. They're creating different kinds of receptors to receive godliness in a different way. You see, the flavors are not in godliness. Godliness is one. The flavors is in our ability to receive it. So when you talk about spiritual worlds, you can almost say in a weird kind of way, there are no spiritual worlds. There are spiritual receptors that create spiritual worlds. Because every individual person who's ever lived and had a relationship with God and done what he wanted and done it with a certain amount of feeling and meaning and intellectual and spiritual, emotional, sensual and spiritual investment is defining the godliness they're going to receive because they're defining the receptors that are going to receive that light and bring it to themselves. Using a more appropriate spiritual term, when we talk about godliness, we use the word ta'anug, delight. Tainug, the pleasure of godliness. I know about the pleasure of pizza with extra cheese. I know about the pleasure of what? Oneg Shabbat. I'm not as holy as you are. There's all kinds of pleasures. Pleasures of a new car, pleasures of a nice outfit, pleasures of a beautiful home. There are all kinds of pleasures, right? But there's something called spiritual pleasures. Spiritual pleasures are difficult for us to relate to. Why? Because to relate to spiritual pleasures, one of the weird rules about spirituality is that you have to go away from material pleasures. They're conflicted. They contradict each other. They cancel each other out. And as a result, if we want to have a connected to spiritual delight, we have to part, we have to separate ourselves from material pleasures. The more effective and efficient we are at making that separation, the more fine and in tune we are to spiritual pleasures. But spiritual pleasures are incredibly rewarding. But there's a sacrifice. I have to give up lower pleasures to have a relationship with higher pleasures. And the more refined, the more elevated I am as a person, the more sensitized I am as a human being, the more qualitatively rich the experience of spirituality, the experience of godliness that I am going to have. So if you want to think about Gan Eden, how many Gan Edens are there? How many gardens of delight, how many spiritual realms are there where souls for millennia who have studied Torah and done mitzvahs with great meaning and passion and investment, are experiencing godliness or the light of God. How many such worlds exist? And the answer is, as many as there are souls. Because in an interesting way, this is a bit of a simplification, but there's some truth to this, a lot of truth to this. We define our Gan Eden. We define our own spirituality. We define our own experience of delight. We define our own godliness because it's a reflection. It's not strictly an expression of the light of God. It's the light of God that's qualified as it's defined by our receptors, by our kalim, by our wings, by our reflectors. And consequently, there are many different types of service, many different types of delight. That's what it says in Hasidus. There are an infinite number of infinite realms. But there's something very important you must understand about all of these realms. This is only godliness, it's not God. Because godliness is called a light, because godliness is defined as a metaphor of light, we have a notion of two things interfering with one another, two things complicating one another, two things defining one another by the relationship. Anytime two things meet, each is affected by the opposite. Godliness meets my receptor. My receptor is enlightened, and godliness is defined. If there are 10 people, there's 10 godlinesses. If there's 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100, a million people, 1 billion people, the number of different definitions for what godliness is by that complex, by that combination, by that duality of the light of God that is defined by each recipient of that light. But God himself is one. In Olam Haba, the so-called world to come, which according to Nachmanides that I mentioned to you before, ironically happens in the physical world, because the physical world is the place and the plane where the notion of submission, total bittul, I'm doing it only for God, not for me, is possible. And it's expressed in the physical deeds of the physical mitzvahs. That's one. God is one. And the mysticism to this is the following idea. Think about this. And I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story, which is an incredibly Hasidic story. When I say it's an incredibly Hasidic story, I mean to say that in this story is revealed the philosophical chiddush, the philosophical novelty of Chassidus. The Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, said to his son, the Middle Rebbe, his son and successor, after Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, one year, he said, Berel, mit was ist gedaven? Which means, he said to his son Berel, his name was Dov, Berel, what did you meditate on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? What were your meditations? So the son says to the father, I meditated that b'chol koyma lefanechas eshtachave, how the geula ak, or makifim b'tachta sha'asiyah. You understand Kabbalah? What kind of Sfadi are you? Igulei ak, v'tachas ro'yei seila, v'tachas ro'ot olam. I'll say it for you in Sfadi, then of course you'll understand, yeah? V'tachas ro'ot olam, igulei adam kadmon, sovavim b'tachtita asiyah. Hivanta? Hakol b'seder. Don't worry about it, I don't either understand. Basically it means the highest level of godly light that exists in creation envelops all of creation. The highest level of godly light is not discriminate. It's the same in Atzilus, the same in Asiyah, the same in Ak. That's basically what it means. In other words, he meditated on unity, but the unity of light. The idea that when you talk about a lower level of light, you can start saying this one has it this way, this one has it this way, this one has it the third way. The highest lights are uniform. But the story doesn't finish. The Middle Rebbe was not a fool. And he says to his father, the Alter Rebbe, he says, Tate, mit was hast du gedaven? He says to his father, so what did you pray? What were your meditations? And the Alter Rebbe said, mit Stender, with the lectern, with the piece of wood that his siddur was sitting on. What was he telling his son? You were meditating on light. A lower light, a higher light, the highest light. I was meditating on the fact that if there's a piece of wood, there's God. Because if there wasn't a God, there wouldn't be the piece of wood. In other words, in mysticism, when you talk about a relationship, you talk about imports, bringing heaven down to earth, bringing God into our world. That's godliness. But there's another truth. And the other truth is that if God had not created this world would not exist. So you don't have to import. You have to export. You have to extract. You don't have to bring light into your prayer. You have to identify that God is in everything. It's a very, very different concept. And in terms of a person, that means this. I have a relationship with God because I have a soul. How many different souls are there? Well, there's different bodies, different measures of intelligence, and all the rest. And accordingly, the souls have different impacts on us. The same illusion of light that I gave you before. But instead of using a light and a reflector, use a soul and a body. The bodies are very individual. No two are alike. Correspondingly, the way the soul enters into the body and the way the soul and body interact is very, very individuated. But there's another truth. The body is godly. Because if it weren't, finish the sentence, it wouldn't exist. That is called having God, as opposed to having godliness. The light of God is a relationship between something spiritual and something which is receiving that spirituality. The result of this is that there's many levels. And the levels are defined not by God, the levels are defined by us. Having God means identifying that the truth of our very existence is Him, or it. And that's one, with a capital I. That's one. It's absolutely true. And that's the second concept of reward and the third concept of reward. The second concept of reward is a spiritual reward. A spiritual reward means we have made ourselves a vessel, we have made ourselves a reflector, and God gives us His light. How much of the light do we have? It's not defined by God. It's defined by our vessel. It's defined by our reflectors. And then we have submitted to God. In our submission to God, we have a relationship with Him. In our physical mitzvahs, which we perform with our physical body, we don't have access to the light of God, we have God Himself. And this is one size fits all. So the lower reward is individuated. The higher reward is absolute. The lower reward happens in a spiritual world because this world is incompatible with spirituality. The absolute reward is the neshama comes back. That's why Kabbalah holds the end of all of existence is the resurrection of the dead. That's Nachmanides' view. We live forever in a physical body. Rambam Maimonides says no. The body dies because the body is redundant and a distraction and a burden, and the soul lives on. And of course, Kabbalah and Hasidus teach us that there are these two concepts. The spiritual meaning that we invest in our religious life earns us a spiritual reward. The absolute investment we invest in our relationship with God, which is really only one thing, our submission, our doing what God said, gets us an absolute reward. So you have three notions. You do it a favor for another person, another person benefiting this lifetime, you should benefit as well. The spiritual reward which we experience in an individuated way, in a spiritual realm, and the absolute reward which all of us experience equally, which we experience in this world. Now, I want to insert into this discourse fancy Hebrew words. In other words, I just gave you a theological dissertation, if you will, discourse. But in this letter, the Alter Rebbe doesn't just give us a theological dissertation, he links this theological dissertation to a number of Maimonides Chazal, rabbinic allusions. And I want to share those with you. First of all, okay, he says, the spiritual reward, which is individual, each one of us experiences differently, comes from what's called Chokhmah, or Yud, the beginning of Ishtalshalos. Because Chokhmah, the highest level of world, is already a level. And spirituality is all about levels. So the spiritual reward we get for our spiritual investment, which according to the discussions we had before, is very individual, begins with the Madrega of Chokhmah. And he adds, the Gemara says, the Talmud says, Talmidei Chachamim ein lahem menucha ba'olam hazeh, lo ba'olam hazeh, lo ba'olam ba. The righteous have no rest, not in this world, not in the next world. This is why they're constantly growing. Growth in the physical world we understand, but what is growth in the spiritual world? Growth in the spiritual world means that as we sensitize ourselves in the spiritual realms, we receive different light. In other words, we can refine our reflectors, we can refine our vessels, we can refine our sensitization. So as a person spiritually grows, what are they changing? Themselves. What is the consequence? The experience of godliness changes. So we're constantly changing. In the spiritual world, the neshama, after it's dead, it's constantly growing. The growth is in the neshama, but the consequence of that growth is that from a perspective of what you're experiencing, it's like flying from a world, from one infinity to another infinity, to another infinity, to another infinity. Ein lehem menucha, they have no rest. They're constantly growing. Then, and he also connects this specifically to meditation. He said this is the spirituality of the Torah that we study. He brings a day from the Talmud that just as we learn halachot, we learn laws down here in the physical world to deal with physical questions, in the spiritual realms they learn the parallel of those halachas on a spiritual level. And just as we are understanding it, they're understanding it in their level. And the reward for their understanding is a spiritual delight, which is beyond the delight we can experiencing by understanding that halacha in the physical. He goes into a whole story about how the rabbis in the heavens were having an argument. Suffolk say love and kodem lebeheres. You understand what that means? Don't worry about it. And there was a machlokes, there was an iflagu ben sifta. Who was the argument between? Between Mesifta Derekia and Kutchabrichu. Kutchabrichu, which some people translate as God, was having an argument with the heavenly courts. I didn't know they had such arguments. The Talmud tells a story. Suffolk say love, lebeheres says shaila if it's saras. Don't worry about it. And they needed to determine the halacha. Only one problem. There's no mitzvahs up there. So the Gemara says, they said, Man noichach. Who is physically alive that can paskin for us? And they said, the Rabbi Nachmani, the teacher of Abaye, the great sage Abaye. Rabbi Nachmani, one of the greatest Amiroim of all. Rabbi Nachmani, the Gemara says, Yochid ben Negoyim v'olos, Yachid ben Nagim v'olot. You know the most complicated laws of Tum and Tara better than anybody. It's a long story in the Gemara, in Bab Metzia, you look it up. And he had to paskin. But in order for him to paskin, he also had to pass away. It's a long story. The last word he said before he died was tahor. He paskined the halacha about the machlokes between Kutchabrichu and Mesifta Derekia. And there are those opinions who paskin like Mesifta Derekia and not like Kutchabrichu. In halacha, we don't necessarily paskin like Kutchabrichu. It's a long story. I don't want to shatter your world. These are very interesting ideas. So the question becomes, what kind of argument are they having in the heavens about Suffolk said the white hair came before or after the leprosy? Who cares in heaven? There's no leprosy up there. Of course, the answer is there's something spiritual that parallels the physical thing. And they were concerned with the spiritual mirror of our physical mitzvah. And they needed us to make the determination, because Allah is only here. So Rabbi Nachmani had to paskin for them. Point, everything that we do on the physical level has a spiritual parallel. And as the neshama ascends from level to level, its sensitization to experiencing the same ideas on a finer spiritual plane grows. So the Gemara says, Talmidei Chachamim ein lehem menucha, lo be'olam hazeh, v'lo be'olam haba. They're never at rest. But that's in the spiritual realms. In Olam Haba, in Tchiyat HaMitim, when the neshama returns to the guf and has, in effect, an intimacy with God, there's no levels. That's absolute. And in discussing this, he brings another series of Maimonic Chazal. He begins by making a Kabbalistic statement. And the statement is that the absolute reward for a relationship with God, which is a relationship with God himself, is keser, as opposed to chokhmah. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. I don't either know. It's a higher level. Keser means a crown, higher than Ishtajlos. And on this basis, he explains the Gemara. The Gemara describes, the Talmud describes Olam Haba, what's going to happen in Tchiyat HaMitim, that the righteous are going to sit with crowns on their head. Now, what does that mean, a crown? And the answer is that in Olam Haba, in Tchiyat HaMitim, the reward is going to come from the level which is called crown. That's right, Keser, Ein Sof. The turban?
No. That what the other guy, not our cousin, when they picture him, they always have that halo around.
Right, the halo, but it's not, whatever. Okay, it's not the same thing. And on this basis, he brings a Maimon Chazal. The Gemara says that Asidin, Yisro, sheyikru kadosh. Eventually the Jewish nation is going to be called holy. Kadosh. Holy, yes. And, that's right. Holy, what does holy mean? Holy means absolutely removed. There's another Ma'amar Chazal which is not brought here in the Tanya, but it's brought in other places. It says, Asid, Asidim, Tzadikim, Sheyikru, B'shmoi Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This doesn't say in this Tanya, but it says in other places, in the future Jews are going to be called by the name of God. What does that mean? It means that there's going to be a point at which there's such a connection between a Jew and God, you can say that this is God. It's a much, much higher level. And this level, there are no levels. In other words, the idea that the greatest reward that we have for Torah and mitzvahs is based on the deepest gift to God that we can give, which is complete submission and acceptance, is a connection with Hashem Himself. This is beyond everything. But of course, the plot thickens. The Rebbe makes the plot, adds another dimension to it. And the dimension that he adds is this. And this is a bit tricky. It's a bit tricky because I don't understand it fully myself. But it's an idea which is brought in Chassidut and Chassidus. And I'm going to try my best to explain it. What we have discussed tonight is that there is relative godliness and absolute God. Relative godliness means we experience spirituality and godliness based on our own level. Absolute God is God. Finished. There's a catch. What's the catch? If you climb levels of spiritual godliness, do you get closer to God? Yes or no? No. Why? Because there's infinite steps. You cannot climb infinite steps. There's always more. In other words, if godliness is defined by me, that's the highest level of defining godliness by me has nothing to do with the truth. So it's a separate gift. We have the gift of godliness, which is a reflection of us, and God is going to give us another gift for our submission that we're going to have a relationship with Him, the absolute truth of God. They're completely separate. Says the Alter Rebbe, think about this. Your experience of godliness is personal. It's defined by me, right? Which means it's not the truth, it's my truth. But there's something very, very positive about it. And what is that? I can actually experience it. The absolute truth of God is the best thing in the world. It's the absolute truth of God. What's the problem? I can't experience it. The only way to experience the absolute truth of God is to be God, and I'm not, I'm me. So the Alter Rebbe says a very interesting idea. He says, in Olam HaTchir, in other words, in this final concept of reward, where the Jew is given an experience of God Himself for our submission and doing our mitzvahs, the spirituality that we earned, that allows us to have a relationship with godliness, will enlighten our connection to the absolute truth of God. In other words, you did one mitzvah, you have Elam Haba, finished. You did one mitzvah, you have a connection to God Himself. But what does it feel like? That depends on how much spiritual investment you made. If you invested spiritually more, the light, the godliness affects that the connection to God Himself should be more enlightened. If you have less spirituality, the connection to God Himself is absolute, but the capacity to feel it is diminished. In other words, the secondary reward, which is the spirituality and the godliness, which is personal, depends on us. That secondary reward, the experience of spirituality, will affect, to a greater extent or a lesser extent, an enlightening, allowing us to feel the absolute truth of God. In other words, if you're more spiritually in tune, you will feel more the truth of God. If you are less spiritually in tune, you'll have the same truth of God, but you won't feel it as much. And this is what I told you earlier that Rebbe Marash said, the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe said once, in Olam Matchia and in Olam Haba, in this final stage, the neshama, the soul, is going to be sustained by the body. The body is going to be one with God. The soul is less than that. But the sensitivity of the soul, there's a bigger soul, there's a smaller soul. There's a better developed soul, and there's a soul which is not so well developed, will affect Not how much of the truth we have, but the degree to which we can feel that truth. And finally, the Iggeres Hakodesh talks about tzedakah. And he says this. There's a pasuk in Tilim. L'chol tichla re'isi kates. Rechava mitzvahs chamayid. I know, I have to say things in English first. L'chol tichla re'iti kates. Rechava mitzvah chamayid. L'chol tichla translates every pleasure has an end. Every delight has a limit. Pizza with extra cheese has a limit. A Rolls Royce has a limit. The spiritual reward for having been a spiritually in tune Jew also has a limit. The mitzvahs that we perform are infinitely broad, and the emphasis is on the deed. The physical mitzvahs that we perform give us an infinity, absolute infinity, a connection to God Himself. And he says, there are 630 mitzvahs. Which one of those mitzvahs does God practice most? Tzedakah. He's giving all the time. So, although it's true that any time a Jew does any mitzvah, the spiritual investment in that mitzvah is going to get him the chol tichla, it's going to get him a spiritual reward. The physical deed and the submission is going to get him a connection to Hashem Himself. But when we do the mitzvah that God performs, which is tzedakah, this is compounded. This is much more. He calls it derech Hashem, and this means havaya, not ishtalshus, but havaya atzmos amos. When I give tzedakah, I am doing what God does. And when I give tzedakah, I have a connection to God, consequently. And that God is an absolute connection. It's a totally infinite connection. So the spiritual connection we have for the spiritual aspect, or half of our religious life, gets us a reward which ultimately is limited. The physical deed of doing what God wants, and specifically giving tzedakah, gives us an absolute connection with an absolute God, which has no limits whatsoever. Which of course leads us to a very, very important and profound religious Jewish message. And that is this. In Judaism, mitzvahs are not symbols. I tell my students, symbolism is heresy. Of course, it's heresy. You don't put on tefillin because they mean. You don't eat matzah because it means. You don't shake a lulav because it represents. These are divine acts. It has a meaning also. But if you added up all the meanings behind any mitzvah, it doesn't amount to the mitzvah itself. The mitzvah itself, which from a human perspective means my capacity to submit to the will of God, is truer and gets me more in touch with the absolute truth than all the meditations and all the spirituality and all the rest. Which of course explains why when the Rebbe started the movement of Kiruv, bring people out to Yiddishkeit, he introduced the notion of mivtzoyim. Meet a Jew, do a mitzvah. People mock Lubavitch. You go out on the street, you meet a Jew, you put on tefillin with him. You're never going to say it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money. It's not true. Because when you do a mitzvah with a Jew, you have given him a connection to God. You lecture him and you philosophize with him, you give him all kinds of enlightenment. It doesn't add up to one single mitzvah. Because in a mitzvah, a Jew has a connection to the Eibshter himself. I'm going to answer you to the best of my abilities. Every single path has its strengths. And you can find superiority in a life dedicated to Torah. You can find superiority in a life dedicated to tzedakah. And it's apples and oranges. It's very, very difficult to measure. But ultimately, according to Chassidus, your statement is true. Being involved in giving tzedakah supersedes love.
Studying Torah is more of a self-share.
Unless you manage to study Torah selflessly, which is a very difficult thing to do, because it's very, very rewarding.